Hello everyone. Our next speaker is Anika Gupta. She has been working to find interdisciplinary and community-driven solutions to large journalistic problems. She spent the past year researching the ways in which participatory media challenge traditional journalistic practices. As a journalist, she covered science and technology for news all over the world. From 2009 to 2014, she lived in New Delhi, where she covered science policy for the Hindustan Times. And she started an interdisciplinary community group devoted to brainstorming better ways to marry journalism and technology. I present to you Anika Gupta.
Thank you so much, Pradeep. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. So I am going to be, you just had an amazing discussion by Joshua Benton about the future of journalism. And I'm going to hopefully go into greater depth about one of these ideas that's floating around a lot, which is this somewhat contested term known as engagement and audience engagement. So I was just chatting with Pradeep briefly before I started this, and he was telling me about the work he's doing at the Crimson around web. And I remembered when I was a college journalist 10 years ago, we certainly didn't have the kind of resources and focus on digital that you guys have. So hopefully this will be something interesting for you, and I'd love to hear some of the projects you're engaging in towards the end. So I thought one of the interesting ways for us to begin is kind of thinking about this idea of engagement in greater depth. And when I started to do that, I turned to a framework provided by my friend Anika Gupta, who's the Nieman Fellow here and has thought a lot about engagement. Unfortunately, she couldn't be here today. And she and I settled upon this idea of conversation and what it means to have a really good conversation. So I thought we could start by thinking about that and kind of mapping that together. And I was wondering if everyone has in front of them a blank piece of paper. Do you folks have that? And a pen or pencil with the writing on it. All right, does everyone have paper? Yeah? Okay, cool. All right, so we're going to do, I wonder if can people still hear me if I move away from the microphone? Yeah, okay, great. So we're going to do an exercise that I actually first did with Nancy Bain from Microsoft Research, and we're going to create a little map. So I want you guys to take about a minute and think back to a really good in-person conversation you've had in your recent memory. It doesn't matter when you had it, but it has to have been in person. Just take a minute, think of an example. You don't need to write anything on that paper yet. Okay, great. Do people have ideas in mind for what they want to think about? And I might ask some of you guys to share yours afterwards, so maybe not something that is so personal you don't want anyone else to know about it. Okay, so the first thing I want you to do is take that piece of paper, and in the bottom corner, write down where that conversation took place. It could be anything, it doesn't have to be latitude or longitude, it could be my kitchen. And then draw a circle around that. All right, the next thing I want you to do is think about how long that conversation was. And somewhere near where you did that first circle, write that down, draw a second circle around it, and connect it to the first. All right. The next question is, how did that conversation start? Write that answer down, circle around it, connect it to the one you just drew. All right, great. How many people were part of that conversation? That's the next thing. Write it down, connect it to the circle you just drew. person, what was your relationship to the people who were in that conversation with you? Finally, I'm going to give you about a minute, and I want you to come up with as many words as you can to describe the ways that that conversation made you feel. Those can be terms like happy, sad, informed, depressed, anything you want to put in there, and put each of those terms in its own circle and draw a line connecting it to the relationships. Okay. The last thing I'm going to ask you to do on this side is related to that. I want you to think about as many reasons as you can for why this interaction, this conversation was good. And I want you to write each of those down in their own circle, and you can connect them either to the relationships or to the initial circle we drew of location. All right, good. I'm gonna ask you guys to stop and look up. Okay, so the reason that I asked you to do this exercise is I wanted us to start thinking very specifically about what constitutes a good and meaningful conversation with another person. And on the other side, this is where we're gonna move this into a challenge that relates to journalism. I want you to flip that paper over. All right. And I want you to think about the topic of that discussion and just write it at the top of your piece of paper. Okay. Now I want you to go back. And on the other side, you talked about a couple of things. You looked at how that conversation began, you looked at what it made you feel, and you looked at what made it really good to you. On this other side of your paper, I want you to think as a journalist, and think that you have this challenge of structuring an engagement, a moment of engagement, for yourself and your audience around that topic. And it has to be good. And ideally, I want it to be good for one of the same reasons that your in-person conversation was good. So go back and look at those reasons, whatever they were. I know this is a challenging one, but I'll give you a couple of minutes to think about it, and you can use any tools at your disposal. This can be an in-person type of engagement, it can be short in duration, it can be long, it can be online, it can be on any platform you choose. But think about what made that conversation about that topic good, and think about how you would structure a journalistic moment of engagement that drew on those same principles.
you repeat what you're asking for this time around?
Absolutely. I want you to think about the topic of the conversation that we just identified and focused on. And as a journalist, I want you to think about how you would create a moment of engagement, however you define that. That could be something that happens on Twitter, on Facebook, in your daily work as a reporter. Create a moment of engagement with your audience around that topic. But think about how it could be good. And if you're wondering what that means, I want you to look at the reasons that conversation was good and try and bring that to this engagement as a journalist. I know it's a lot of different ideas at once. All right, are folks kind of finishing off? Yeah, I'm seeing some nods. Okay, great. This is where some bravery is called for. I would love to hear some people's ideas. So are there folks who would be willing to share? I want to hear, so I'll ask you, what is the engagement that you created? And tell me why it's good. Volunteers? Anyone want to talk about the engagement they came up with?
By engagement, do you mean like how are you going to address this?
Yeah,
topic?
what do you,
Okay.
yeah, exactly. Can I ask you
Yeah,
to
I
share
can
yours?
go.
Awesome.
The conversation that I thought was meaningful that I had was just talking about like campus like activism with a friend and like how like on our campus, I go to Brown, and also like how that relates to kind of society at large. And so to address that in like a journalistic piece, I was thinking maybe let's say there's a protest at some campus, and instead of just like covering it in a wider sense where like you just see these huge aerial shots of the crowd and the speakers, maybe have videos of people kind of one-on-one that you talk to kind of sharing their own personal experience with activism, so that you can see kind of like a broader picture of maybe what activism looks like, and maybe even people who aren't actually at that event as well. Because I think why that conversation that I had with my friend was good is that it was really grounded in like more personal experiences, and it was also timely as well, and I feel like this is like a pretty timely topic that it was something that was on both of our minds, so that made it a meaningful engagement.
Cool, awesome, that's a wonderful example. Somebody else? Yeah, sure.
Okay, well, my name is Anika, I go to Davidson College. And I guess the conversation I had was with my professor, who is also one of my mentors on campus, at a coffee shop for about 2.5 hours. And essentially, our conversation was talking about like what it actually means to like I guess like being a woman, and like how like that's like informed like by what I'm supposed to be, and like debunking that, and then also talking about that in the context of like consent, and how like consent is very like cultural in different ways, and so we were talking about that, and I thought that was really interesting. And I guess like one thing that you could do to be engaged in that is to like have, and I think our friend over there kind of pushed on that, is like being anecdotal and like kind of explaining people like from different backgrounds, and being intentional about that, and like seeing this like face-to-face interaction with different people as a way to like make sure that everyone feels engaged with that.
Sure. So drawing out the personal and the anecdotal, that's a great way to put it, and how journalists often put it, personal stories. I think that's great. Anyone else who has an idea or wants to share their moment of engagement? Pradeep, since you introduced me, can I put you on the spot to do it?
So I had this conversation about a possible pancake brunch with this friend. So it started with something very relatable, which is normally school. and he was venting his frustration at like how miserable his life is. So my lesson from that was broadcasters like ought to be good listeners as well. And the more you listen to your readers, and then you can like provide content like more relatable to them. And then so we started something relatable, and then like I ended up with a very hopeful note like for next weekend. So yeah, like start with something familiar, be a good listener, and like offer something to look forward to next time.
Have you found that there are particular ways you like to listen to your audience as a journalist? Do you have methods for that?
Like right now we don't. We have an active comment section. We receive a lot of comments, but like we tend not to read any of them. So like I'm not sure. Like recently we started like accepting letter to the editors, which we didn't do like years before. So we are making some strides on that. Maybe not like in the most effective way digitally, but like at least in print form.
Okay, that's great. And is there anybody else who would like to kind of share their idea or their thought? Was this a difficult question? Was this a difficult exercise? I mean, the reason I ask that is because I think one of the challenges that I found for journalists in the space of engagement is we know what makes something engaging in our daily lives. We know what it means to have an engaging conversation or a meaningful interaction with somebody else. But for us as journalists, translating that to the wider world of what's available to us professionally has been an incredibly difficult exercise. And I'm actually going to talk a little bit about different ways in which people are doing that and suggest ways that you can look at this term engagement that is so broad and try and make it into something that's meaningful for you as journalists. So first off, I'll do a brief overview. Let me use this clicker. So I will talk a little bit about some of the research that I've done. We don't have a huge amount of time, and I want questions, so I'm going to move through this quickly. But if you have any questions about this, which is much broader than this, please feel free to reach out to me. I put my Twitter handle and my email up there initially. So a lot of my research has focused on the world of comments and news organizations. This is a quote from Nilay Patel of The Verge in July. They had chosen to suspend their comments for a little while, and this is the reason he gave, that he felt the comments had become really aggressive and negative. And they were not alone, as I'm sure many of you saw over this past several months, many news organizations, online news organizations that were born online, as well as traditional publications like Reuters, have decided to discontinue comments. How many of you were familiar with that, had seen those stories, realized it was happening? You just raise your hand. Yeah, cool. So as somebody who had worked in journalism, I was really interested in understanding why this was happening. This is a brief overview. Most of us know what a comment section looks like. But what I wanted to stress here is you've got the story page, which is produced oftentimes by a professional journalist. And then you have this thing kind of at the bottom or side of the page where readers can participate. The comment section has actually been relatively unchanged for about a decade. So I think it's interesting that we're suddenly seeing a lot of news organizations shutting them down now. And what that suggests to me is that we're at a pretty crucial moment for news organizations in terms of defining how we're going to engage with audiences. This participatory mode that we've had for so long is no longer sufficient. It's not working. At the same time, we have this enormous universe of online community that's come into existence. We've got social media, we've got blogs, we've got comment communities, things like collaborative intelligence, which is Wikipedia, collaborative discussion, which is Reddit, in both a positive and a negative sense. These are spaces that are hugely influential. There are discussions happening about news articles on Reddit that are oftentimes more vibrant than what's happening in the news organization's own fora. How do you contend with all of these spaces and the different ways in which people communicate in them? The other thing that I have noticed that I think is a trend for all of us to observe is that we have these two types of media organizations. We have what I refer to as legacy media, who come from a tradition that involves letters to the editor. It goes back hundreds of years. It's a structured communication, a lot of processes in place. And then we have digital media organizations. The example I'm giving here is BuzzFeed, but you could put HuffPo in there as well, or any organization that are kind of born out of the potential of participation that exists online, whether that's the way they use user-generated content, the way they adapt for social media. But what we're seeing is this increasing convergence in what these organizations are trying to do. So you have Huffington Post winning the Pulitzer Prize. You have BuzzFeed hiring journalists away from political news organizations. And at the same time, you have an organization like the New York Times not just getting on Twitter and Facebook, expanding their comments, conducting training for their journalists and how to engage on Reddit. They actually have a training for that now. So So the question is, as we see this increasing convergence in what news organizations are doing, what is the space of engagement? It's something beyond comments, because that's not sufficient anymore, but it is something that is specifically adapted from this wider world of online community. And I think what we are doing right now within the journalism field is trying to figure out what that looks like. So as part of my research, I went to a bunch of different news organizations, and I asked them how they handle their comments right now. I wanted to understand what are some of the key pressures and concerns that are in play. And what I found is that by and large, there is, and based upon what I found, I created this sort of way to think about it, which is that there's a spectrum of decisions that organizations make when they deal with audiences. And they range from, those decisions enable greater audience participation or greater editorial control. And some of those dimensions are, do they have institutional moderation? If they do, who moderates? Where are comments available on stories? When does moderation occur? So as I get into this, I'm curious to know, how many of you come from organizations that have comments on stories? Cool. How many of you have had to moderate one of those comments, or any of those comments? Oh, awesome. How many of you have posted a comment on a news organization webpage? The numbers keep dropping, which is interesting, right? And it's like a lot. Now, how many people, on the other hand, have responded to a news organization on Twitter or Facebook? Yeah? Posted a news story on your own timeline? Yeah? Pretty much everyone? Yeah. So what we're seeing is a migration of conversation around stories. If, to the extent that they ever existed in comment sections, they're going to other spaces. But here's what's happening. So we have an organization like the New York Times, which is often cited as being the most devoted to editorial control. Right? So they have institutionally moderated comments. All of those comments are moderated by in-house journalists. They have a really large team. They only enable comments on a certain number of stories. And all of the comments are moderated before they're published. So essentially, if you're a reader and you're submitting a comment to the New York Times, you have to wait for a human being who works for the Times to approve it before you see it on the page. If it doesn't appear, you really often don't know why. On the other hand, you have an organization like Facebook, which, comments are the story, and nothing's really moderated very much. In between, we have a spectrum of choices and behaviors. A lot of media organizations, large legacy media organizations whom I spoke to, employed a mix of in-house journalists and vendors to moderate their comments. How many of you knew that news organizations have vendors moderate comments? Okay, a few people, yeah. I didn't know this until I started this project. And it's something that's in wide play. What's interesting about vendors is that they're responsible to the news organization, but they're completely invisible to the community. They don't participate in the conversation. Now you contrast that with something like a paid peer model. This is where I started looking at, so we have news organizations kind of on this side of the spectrum. And then towards the other side, we have comment communities, places like Reddit, Metafilter, going on into social media. And one of the metrics that I looked at there, so when we say paid peers, in the context of this project, peers are people who are participants in a community before they become moderators. And being participants is one of the key qualifications in order to become a moderator. So that work is very transparent, and you have an identity in the community. Okay, so this is what is happening with comments, and this tension between editorial control and audience participation is one that not only animates comments, but it also animates the wider universe of what news organizations are doing. So then we have this idea, this emerging idea of what audiences expect. And when we look at comments, we have to, and why they're failing, we have to look at what they're up against. So I spoke to a person who was hired as the first community editor at a large legacy news organization. And one of the things that she said is that they are looking at things like TripAdvisor, Amazon, eBay, and product reviews to figure out users' expectations when they come to journalistic sites. She was also saying that they are very much driven by understanding what makes people share and interact with what they're doing or reading. So that's a very particular mode of communication, sharing and interaction. It's something that's reactive. A lot of times it's emotional. We've all seen Facebook introduce the new emojis, love, haha, wow. That influences the way that journalists think about our content, right? Like if we're putting stories out into the social space, we're thinking, okay, how are people going to react to this? What's going to make them share it with each other? And that's a very different set of concerns from what we might have had earlier before we were on these platforms. So that leads to this question, okay, so what is engagement? And engagement it's a contested term. And it's something that people who are in audience engagement teams at news organizations, and many of you, if you continue in journalism, might end up in these kinds of teams. How many people plan to continue as journalists? I'm imagining if you're here on a weekend, you're probably, okay, all right, so. So you might end up in a team like this. These are teams that are growing at news organizations. They have a lot of scope to define their roles, but they're also in a unique position where they are responsible for trying to define what engagement is. And so that tension between the editorial control, the tradition of editorial control, and user expectations and of audience participation is something they are daily negotiating. Engagement is actually a term that comes from or includes the world of marketing as well as journalism. It addresses things like attention, dialogue, interaction, emotions, and activation. And it's a measure of how people react to content after they've been exposed to it. And it's very much driven by this emerging culture of metrics that we have available online. So looking at things like page views and likes and tweets and retweets. These are great measures in that they're quantifiable. They're not great because they don't always capture what a meaningful interaction is. Like when you go back and think about what makes a conversation great in life, you're not thinking about something like, oh, you know, somebody else like gave me a thumbs up as they walked by. And that's meaningful for journalism, right? So then we also look at, within the world of journalism, people are trying to understand what that means. And I think the idea of engagement, what is interesting about it is that it also captures the way in which the production of news is changing, and the extent to which audience tastes, preferences, and feedback, and even content production, increasingly play a role in how news is produced. And as you guys move out into working, and you're in your current roles, and move out into journalism, this is something that's going to increasingly be a universe that you face. That you're going to be aware that people are coming to your organization with expectations formed in spaces that are outside journalism and have very different purposes. And you have to play to those expectations, but at the same time, think about what makes that engagement meaningful for you as journalists. So having introduced that set of large challenges, I'm going to go through a couple of really interesting case studies and examples that answer some questions that I think can help us get started on figuring out what that might look like. The first question that I think you have to ask as you begin any sort of engagement is, what do you want from your community? So a series of interviews that I did over the summer was with an organization called the Coral Project, and they're working on building better tools for community and news organizations. And they said that they went to numerous organizations and asked them this question about comment sections, and many of them actually didn't have an answer. When they said, why do you have this? What is the purpose? They weren't sure. And when you're not sure, that shows in the way a section is administered, who is attracted to it and who stays. So what do you want from your community? And then that is a very specific set of asks. So here's an example of a project that is very specific in terms of what it's asking from its community. This is The Counted by Guardian US. How many of you guys know this project? Okay, cool. So this is a project that they launched, and they are trying to track every single person killed by police in the United States. So when I spoke to people involved in this project, I said, who is the community for this project, right? Because if we're thinking about what you want from your community, embedded in that is this question of whom are you trying to reach? And one of the things they told me is our goal is to reach people who care about police killings, not necessarily, even if those people don't necessarily read The Guardian. And I think that's very interesting because they're looking at their journalistic brand and saying, okay, there's a space where we can engage with people who care about this issue. It's saying that you can serve an interest rather than just a loyalty. So it's a collection of print and online stories, as well as the Facebook community. And when they were forming this project and thinking about what they wanted that Facebook community to be capable of and whether or not they should have one of the things that they noticed is this. There is a gap that they can fill, and this is where that gap lies. Official statistics about people killed by police in the US are incomplete or non-existent. Their research demonstrated that. At the same time, although there are several projects devoted to tracking these numbers, these projects are extensive, but they're completely unverified. So there's this gap where there really isn't a lot of reliable information on either the official or the unofficial side. So then they thought, okay, if we want to create an extensive but reliable set of data, what would that involve? And that was a set of data that was crowdsourced and journalist verified. So this is what it looks like. when they started building this Facebook community, they were very clear that they wanted people whom they spoke to be people who cared about this issue and would want to share information about it, right? So they say building the community is part of the journalism. Our reporters talked to their sources and they built up really close engagement with people in the Black community. So engagement, the reason I'm showing this to you is because engagement is not just a term that applies to what happens online. Engagement can be a practice that happens in the real world between journalists and people whom they talk to, and ideally it should. Where we're seeing meaningful engagement has been with anonymous people who will send 2 to 3 tips a day sometimes. So they're getting a lot of information from this audience. And they said that they're spreading it by word of mouth. So they didn't market it. It wasn't at all that kind of initiative. In many ways, the stories that come out of this aren't even pegged to this community. And that's a decision that some people could critique. But what is very clear about this project, and the reason I wanted to show it to you, is not because it's a perfect example of what journalists can do, but because it is an example of journalists being very clear about what they're trying to get from the community. Now this is, in many ways, this is using Facebook as well as in-person interaction by journalists to cultivate better sources. And that's something we know about. That's something that journalists do. I think what is interesting about the Counted and where it has potential is in bringing the information that those sources offer back into that community of people to inform it and continually shape that coverage. So instead of producing a story and then putting it out there and letting another random group of people converse about it and comment on it, there's this closed loop. The sources are also the audience and the consumers. And so that creates a cycle of people being interested in the material. Okay, back to community. They've also engaged on this project in other spaces. This is a Reddit Ask Us Anything / Ask Me Anything. How many people have read a Reddit Ask Me Anything? Yeah, okay, so we all know, or many of us know what this is. It's, they basically went on Reddit and they solicited feedback from people. This is a great thread and worth reading because they had a whole bunch of valuable feedback. People brought up examples of other terminology. They also had people press back on the ways in which they were constructing their data. What qualified as a police killing, for example? Really specific questions, granular questions that the reporters answered in depth. So this is an attempt to kind of take a platform like Reddit and engage with it in a journalistic way around this question. Okay, so the second question that I think you need to ask, now that you've thought about what do we want from our community and who they are, how they are defined either by an interest, and I think interest-based communities are a great way to go. The other question that you need to know is, in whatever engagement you're structuring, what does your community stand to gain from participating with you? And this is another part of the equation that actually a lot of the times is not very specifically developed. If people aren't getting something out of an interaction, they have no reason to do it. So here I'm going to turn to an example. And I'm going to talk a little bit about a space where I think that this is well developed, and that's BuzzFeed's community. So BuzzFeed, as some of you may know, anybody who comes to the site can actually put a post on BuzzFeed. How many people knew that? Oh, lucky. So essentially, and they deliberately run those stories under bylines that are very similar to staff writer bylines in terms of their styling. And they have a whole community called their community team who work for them. And the goal of these people who work in BuzzFeed's offices is to identify people who are top contributors, reach out to them on social platforms, give them feedback about their writing, occasionally send them little bits of gifts, like little gifts and swag from BuzzFeed, and also solicit and recruit the best ones into a structured editorial fellowship. And this fellowship is a several-month project. It's within one of the main BuzzFeed offices, and there they get extensive and daily mentorship. They're paid, they write for the site, and at the end they're hired into the same community team that found them in the first place. So they have this, and this is like a huge chunk of their workforce, by the way. So when you go there and you talk to people from their community team, there's a good chance that several of them came out of this program. So it's this idea of, okay, you have these so-called peers, people who are potentially interested in participating. Now, what are you giving them for that? What do they hope to gain? And one of the things that, and it's very clear for the news organization, they get this benefit. But when I asked them, so how do you decide who you pull into this? They said, and why? They said, we get people who know the site, which is really valuable for them. They have solid interests, are passionate about things, they know what they're going to come in and write about, and they're open to criticism. So for the people who come into the fellowship, for people who are contributing, there are several things that they can potentially get out of this. One, of course, is that they have a chance to develop their writing voice, that their content might be put on the homepage. One of the people whom I spoke with at BuzzFeed, a member of this team, a paid staffer, actually was a comedian, and she had started using BuzzFeed's community feature to practice writing comedy in a print format. And then she was hired into BuzzFeed. So there's that opportunity. If they get into the fellowship, and along the way, they have this relationship that's built with the organization. Then they have this idea of mentorship if they get into that fellowship. So they get feedback on a very regular basis on how to write for the web. And then finally, they get a possible job. And if BuzzFeed doesn't hire them at the end of the fellowship, which sometimes happens, then there's a good chance they have a great portfolio of work they can take to another publication. So this is another way that we're looking at news organizations creating a structure of value for users. This is not what everybody needs to do, but it answers, this is a very elaborate sort of pipeline answer to this question of why do people contribute to a media organization? So those are two interesting case studies that kind of answer those questions. And what I'll do is I will share this so you guys can go back and refer to it later on if that's useful to you. Okay, so here are, finally, I wanted to recap by going over a couple of tools that are super useful to you. And you may know some of these already. The first is Hearken. So this is a tool for lead generation created by Jennifer Brandel. A lot of it was for community and public media. They're an audience-driven platform. They allow journalists to ask questions of their public and then use those questions to structure stories. So this is an interesting model. They basically say that traditional journalism, comments come after publication. What they want is for the audience to be part of the story, the lead generation and story development process from the beginning. And so they work with multiple news organizations on creating stories like this, and they say that because they come from the community's interests, they tend to result in greater engagement. So they're an interesting model for you guys to take a look at. Civil comments. They do comment moderation, but what they do is they do a crowdsourced system of moderation that is still structured for journalists. So basically, they have this platform. They're now doing, they started last year. They're doing trials with several people. But what they do is anytime you go to post a comment on a news organization website that has enabled civil, you have to review your own comment, and then you get 3 randomly chosen comments by others that you also have to review on metrics like how informative they are, how interesting, how civil they are. And once a comment reaches a certain aggregate score by multiple peer reviewers, it's published to the page where everyone can see it. So this is a way to kind of leverage the people who are already there in that space and interested in contributing to the conversation to make it better. Finally, the Coral Project. I mentioned that I have done some work with them, but they are a partnership based out of the New York Times, but between the New York Times, Mozilla Open News, Night Mozilla Open News, and the Washington Post. And they are a great resource. If you go to their webpage, they have not only a mailing list, but they have a bunch of people who are talking about academics as well as people in the journalism world who are talking about really key questions in audience development. And if you are interested in kind of looking more broadly at what's happening in the world of audience development and what is some of the research that can help you, this is a great listserv to belong to and a great website to look at occasionally. They're also working on building some tools for publishers that they're going to be releasing over a period of time. Cool. So that's that. That was a lot of information in a very short period of time. But I am very much open to any questions that you guys have. Yes.
Hi. I know I'm Danielle from Good News. I know a lot of our commenters and people interacting with our stories that we can see through Twitter are old white men, and I know that Wikipedia, only 15% of editors are women because it's a space that men try to drive women out by being hostile. So I wonder like kind of what you maybe learned about gender through research, but also how do we disrupt that and attract more female engagement, and also just make it a better space for them?
Yeah. I think that's a really good point, and yes, that's a problem in comment spaces as well. A lot of them, the Washington Post, for example, they had a post about this. So one of the things that I think I'll link to is really interesting. An example from Metafilter, comment community. Basically, one of the things they stressed is the importance of moderation in spaces like that. So if you're going to have a comment space, you got to just moderate it. And they had not only very clear guidelines, but their moderators would kind of step in, shape that discussion, and they would make decisions that were editorial in nature. Like they decided they wanted to make the space safer for the trans community. So they decided on a certain number of rules related to that. We're not going to have what is termed misgendering. And every time it happened, they just threw it out and said, we're not allowing this. But you have to be really engaged on a regular basis enforcing those norms. And then the other, so that's one approach to that, that involves like a fair bit of dedication. I think the other, yeah, I mean, I'm open to other suggestions on this one. I think that is like an ongoing challenge. And I think moderation and rules is one step in terms of solving it. I think one of the reasons why we're seeing that is because comment sections are just not well managed or attended by people even at news organizations for a long period of time. So they became just hateful. The other thing is creating, for people who are moderators, creating systems of support so they feel empowered to take action not just against trolls, but creating tools that help them do that, I think is really important. A lot of times people who are responsible for doing audience engagement, traditionally, or not, there's no tradition here, but it'd be one person sitting in like, you know, somebody's repurposed closet, reading comments and posting tweets in between. And that's not a system, that person isn't a burnout. So I think, yeah, so it's, yes, having careful moderation and then supporting that moderator in their work, appreciating that it is an emotionally difficult task. Other question? Yeah.
I'm wondering, for like a college newspaper, who do you think should be doing the moderation? So I know that it depends based on different, so like, should it be the editorial side? Is that, because I'm curious who you think should be doing it?
I think it depends on the individual journalist. I would not suggest that journalists be required ever to moderate their own comments. For example, because that can just be incredibly painful. But to be honest, I increasingly think that moderation is a skill set, and having and attracting people who are good at that is really valuable for any organization. One of the people whom I spoke to at BuzzFeed who does that work actually said he didn't necessarily come from a journalistic background. He was more interested in roles in marketing and research. That's not a space that journalism or like groups normally go to, but maybe there are people who are interested in building those kinds of relationships who are on your campus already who you can talk to about how to do that effectively. And maybe those are people who would be interested in kind of an empowered moderator role. So that's one way to look at it. And then in terms of like, you know, engagement, kind of in that broader sense of engagement that I was talking about it, I think that's something that journalists and editors have to talk about from the beginning of the story. Like, what does it mean to engage? If you're going into a space or a community or a story, is there potential to get people into a broader discussion? What do you want that to look like? Whom do you want to attract? And then kind of structure a lot of even the in-person reporting around that. Does that, yeah.
Time for one more question.
Okay, yes.
Some of the like tactics, like it just seems like there's a lot of overlap between like marketing and also like journalism and some of this work that you're doing. And so I'm curious do you feel like that sometimes potentially like compromises like some of the, I guess, norms of like journalistic ethics and integrity that we've learned in places like college newspapers?
I think, so the idea that there is this clear, so there's a multifaceted answer to your question. The distinction between sort of the commercial and the editorial sides of the news business is eroding. And we're seeing that specifically happening in teams like audience engagement. And I think potentially one solution, rather than saying that transgresses ethics, is to figure out how to be transparent about the ways in which that's occurring. So a lot of people have talked about this idea of transparency as a solution to this modern question of objectivity. And I think that is really valuable, because I think this is going to continue to happen. This work is going to continue to happen. Like, news organizations that want to be relevant today are going to be engaging with audiences on platforms not their own. They're going to be looking at metrics. They're going to be doing all of that stuff. And that relates to the commercial question of audiences. So if that's happening, then I think the question is, how do you be upfront with readers about that, and how do you think about then what that means for you as a journalist? That doesn't mean you need to be managing your work to how many people are going to like something, and in fact you shouldn't. Your engagement team should encourage you not to do that as well. But yeah, I mean, this does address marketing too. That's there. Other questions? Oh, do we have just one question? Okay, all right, well that's fun. Thank you so much, you guys. I hope this was interesting and helpful to you. Please feel free to ask me any questions, email, tweet, anything. I'd welcome any feedback you have.